This lecture provides an introduction to the history of Israel and Palestine, focusing in on Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people, as well as U.S. complicity in Israel's ongoing genocide. I adapted this from a teach-in I helped to lead for a group I'm involved with called Jewish Voice for Peace Sacramento. I've inserted a gender and sexual analysis into this broader history, which we don't normally hear about. So just a content warning, much of what I discuss here is hard to hear. I refer to extreme levels of violence, which includes reference to sexual violence. There are several key ideas I hope to convey in this lecture. First, Israel's presence in Palestine is fundamentally a history of settler colonialism, and Israel is currently a settler colonial state. This is essential for understanding what's happening in Gaza right now. Second, beginning in October 2023, Israel's actions in Gaza have been genocidal in nature. Israel is using genocidal violence much the same way Americans and Europeans have in colonizing Native Americans and their lands. Colonialism is enacted through violence. Third, Israel's oppressive treatment of the Palestinian people is funded by U.S. taxpayers. In other words, Israel cannot commit its genocide without the full support of the U.S. government, which is why we have such an important role to play in understanding this topic and challenging U.S. support for Israel's actions. Fourth, Israel's violence against the Palestinians is also a form of gendered and sexual violence. Colonialism and war are never not gendered. As we know from Native American history, sexual and reproductive violence are often central tools in the colonial arsenal. Also, Israel uses queer people and queer rights as a way to direct attention away from its crimes. Fifth, and finally, anti-Zionism is rooted in a radical critique of the state of Israel due to its treatment of Palestinians. Anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish prejudice or discrimination because one is Jewish, not because one supports Israel or is Israeli. Thus, anti-Zionism is not the same thing as anti-Semitism, though accusations of anti-Semitism have been used to suppress activism against Israel's actions. This is important to emphasize because the false conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is meant to boost the public support or silence around U.S. complicity in Israel's genocide and occupation of the Palestinian people. Before diving into the history, I'll go over the current situation in Gaza. You may have seen in the news that Israel has been attacking Gaza since October 7th, 2023. So why October 7th? On October 7th, the military wing of Hamas, a political organization which governed the Gaza Strip since 2007, launched a brutal attack on southern Israel, targeting both civilians and military installations. Hamas ultimately killed nearly 1,200 people and took 251 people hostage, most of them civilians. So why did Hamas attack Israel? Because of a long history of Israeli colonialism and military occupation, which I'll spend most of this lecture discussing. While violence against civilians shouldn't be justified, it's important to understand the conditions that cause such violence if we care about finding a path forward to end the violence. Israel reacted by launching a military assault against the entire Palestinian population in Gaza, which has not ceased since then. As you can see on the board, Gaza is a tiny strip of land. Just over 2 million people live in Gaza under very crowded conditions. Because Israel controls Gaza's borders, which it's controlled since 1967, Palestinians living in Gaza cannot easily escape. As of November 2024, here are some facts. While many in the media use language like Israel-Hamas war, the truth is that Israel is targeting all Palestinians, not just Hamas fighters. Since October 7th, Israel has engaged in a relentless assault on the entire Palestinian population in Gaza, killing at least 44,000 people and approximately 17,000 children. Given that many more Palestinians are still buried under the rubble of their homes, the death toll is certainly much higher than this. According to the United Nations, around 70% of those killed are women and children. There have been more women and children killed in Gaza by the Israeli military than in any other recent conflict in a single year. Though, to be clear, innocent Palestinian men have also been killed in large numbers, and not focusing on Palestinian men's humanity feeds into the racist trope that Palestinian men are all terrorists, which serves to justify the violence. Israel has also targeted Gaza's civilian infrastructure. Israeli explosives hit civilian infrastructure in Gaza, including schools, hospitals, homes, and aid distribution points, once every 3 hours. And Israel has destroyed every single university in Gaza. And as of November 5th, 2024, a mere 17 of Gaza's 36 hospitals remain functional, and only partially so. And there are 100,000 wounded people in Gaza, of which around 14,000 require medical evacuation to receive specialized care. But Israel turns down 60% of these requests to leave Gaza for medical reasons, according to the World Health Organization. And due to the lack of care and constant bombardment and sniper shots by Israel soldiers, Gaza has the highest number of child amputees per capita globally, according to the United Nations. And many children have been forced to undergo amputations without anesthesia because Israel has blocked medical supplies from entering Gaza. As of November 2024, 90% or 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced, most multiple times due to bombings and evacuation orders. According to the United Nations, a quarter of all structures are destroyed or severely damaged, and 66% of structures, including 227,000 housing units, have sustained at least some damage. And Palestinians have been entirely pushed out of northern Gaza recently, with Israel essentially committing an ethnic cleansing of the region, which is a war crime. Hundreds of thousands now live in crowded tent encampments with no electricity, no running water or toilets, and where hunger is widespread. In fact, many have argued that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of genocide by prohibiting food aid from crossing Gaza's borders. So here's a quote. "This war is destruction and misery. It would make the stones cry out," said Shifa Hejo, a 60-year-old housewife living in a tent pitched on land where her home once stood. "Whoever sees Gaza, it will make them cry," unquote. Many pregnant women are unable to access the few hospitals that exist due to dangerous conditions and are forced to give birth in tents. And the lack of access to prenatal care puts them at risk of complications, including maternal and infant mortality. I'm tempted to keep going with statistics, but I'll leave it here for now. So why did Israel attack Gaza? Clearly, October 7th was the trigger, but it would be a mistake to view October 7th as the reason for its violence. Just as Hamas's attack on October 7th can't be understood without historical context, we can't understand Israel's ongoing military assault, its mass displacement of Palestinians, its destruction of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, and its removal of Palestinians from northern Gaza, without underscoring Israel's long-standing political goals. These political goals involve increasing displacement of Palestinians over decades, taking the land from them, and establishing Israeli control over the land and its resources. So Israel's mass murder of Palestinians and destruction of civilian infrastructure is so awful that South Africa charged Israel with genocide before the International Court of Justice. And the court found the accusations to be plausible and is pursuing the case. In response, Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, said, "Nobody will stop us." And since January of 2023, when the court decided to pursue the case, Israel has continued its onslaught. An Amnesty, January 2024. An Amnesty International issued a 300-page report in December of 2024, providing substantial evidence that Israel is committing genocide. The UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, codified in 1948 following the Holocaust, defines those committing genocide as doing so with, quote, "the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, unquote, by committing acts such as, quote, killing members of the group, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, whole or in part. Also included in this definition, quote, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, unquote. Central to the IJC case was not only the incredible levels of indiscriminate violence, but also the dehumanizing rhetoric used by Israeli political leaders to justify the violence. Here are just a couple of quotes that illustrate the point. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, citing the Torah, quote, you must remember that what Amalek has done to you. Amalekites were persecutors of biblical Israelites, and a commandment says they must all be destroyed. South Africa's lawyers argued that this involved calling for the destruction of Palestinians as a people. And Defense Minister Yoav Gallant referred to Palestinians as, quote, human animals. Another member of the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, wrote on X that Israelis had one common goal, erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. Personally, I think it's clear that Israel's actions are indeed genocidal in nature. And this is all done with U.S. Support. Since Israel began attacking Gaza, the U.S. government has refused to stop arms shipments to Israel, instead choosing to increase military aid to Israel. In 1 year, October 2023 to September 30th, 2024, according to researchers at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, the U.S. has spent $22.76 billion on military aid to Israel and related operations in the region. The authors emphasize that this is a conservative estimate. The report makes clear that the U.S. has been Israel's main weapon supplier for 50 years, following Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. In fact, Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. aid in the world since World War II, and it is in the midst of a 10-year, $38 billion military aid agreement negotiated under the Obama administration, covering 2019 to 2028. The Pentagon said, quote, the United States is committed to the security of Israel, and it is vital to U.S. national interest to assist Israel to develop and maintain a strong and ready self-defense capability, unquote. It's clear that the U.S. is allied with Israel politically because of its geopolitical interests and maintaining Israel as a base of support in the Middle East, no matter the humanitarian cost. It's also clear that without U.S. support by both Democrats and Republicans, the violence couldn't continue. So let's connect this to gender and sexuality. One major way that Israel builds support is through an active public relations campaign in which it paints itself as a liberal democracy, one that's culturally liberal. As part of its supposed cultural liberalism, it portrays itself as a promoter of women's rights and as gay-friendly, in contrast to the so-called backward Arab and Muslim societies it's surrounded by, including in contrast to Palestinian culture. When Israel uses women's rights as a way to justify its oppression of the Palestinian people, and when people who call themselves feminists agree, scholars have coined a term for this. It's called imperial feminism. Imperial feminism has also been called colonial feminism. In essence, it refers to the uses of feminist rhetoric to justify imperialism and colonialism. It's fundamentally rooted in anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism, broadly as well, because all Arab nations and all Muslims get painted with one simplistic brush. They are sexist, and we are not. When in reality, sexism is very much still rampant in places like Israel and the United States, and not all Arab and Muslim societies are the same. The U.S. government, as well as many Americans who support Israel, promote imperial feminism to justify our foreign policy for Israel. This is an example of imperial or colonial feminism. This article appeared in the Jerusalem Post on December 15th, 2023, in the midst of some of the worst days of Israel's genocide in Gaza. The story lauds this particular so-called feminist advancement. the author writes, quote, I was lucky enough to watch firsthand as female combat soldiers from the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, co-ed infantry Bardelis, Cheetah Battalion, broke through another glass ceiling that most of the women of my generation didn't even know was something that we could dream about. The author quotes a female soldier fighting in Gaza. From our point of view, we're in enemy territory. Every structure we pass poses a threat. Terrorists could be hiding in them or in tunnels that we cannot see. In other words, the soldier is justifying widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the author is celebrating the soldier's service as, quote, breaking the glass ceiling. So why is this problematic? The violence female soldiers are inflicting is genocidal in nature. Genocidal violence is dehumanizing. It always involves sexual and reproductive violence. It disproportionately harms women and children. And imperial feminism celebrates women serving as soldiers who are killing Palestinian women, killing their children, and destroying their society. And critics have called Israel's cynical use of gay rights to bolster support for its policies as pinkwashing. Pinkwashing refers to Israel's campaign to distract from its egregious violations of international law and the human, civil, and political rights of Palestinians by shining a bright light on its supposed cultural liberalism and its supposed fun, fabulous, and gay-friendly culture. Israel funds public relations via Brand Israel to increase support for Israel. As Nada Elia says for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, quote, Pinkwashing juxtaposes a falsely progressive image of Israel with a racist portrayal of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim societies as backwards, repressive, and intolerant. This is part of a long-standing colonial logic that uses racist Orientalist portrayals to justify Western colonization as a way of saving and freeing the colonized, who are too uncivilized to rule themselves. In another context, Nada Elia insists there is no magic pink door in the apartheid wall, which surrounds the West Bank. Here are just a couple of recent examples of pinkwashing. This is an IDF soldier carrying the, quote, first LGBT flag in Palestine. In the background, you can see bombed buildings. This is in Gaza. This is also a version of what queer theorist Jasper K. Puar calls homo-nationalism, which is the association of queer people with nationalism. Another way to put it, right, putting queer folks in service of colonialism and imperialism. Here's another example. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was invited to speak before Congress in the summer, last summer. In his speech before Congress, he said, quote, some of these protesters hold up signs proclaiming gays for Gaza. They might as well hold signs up saying chickens for KFC, unquote. This is from the guy who was overseeing a genocide of the Palestinian people, and that genocidal violence did not create a pathway to safety and prosperity for queer Palestinians. In general, of course, at worst, pinkwashing and imperial feminism build support for Israel in a context in which it's completing horrendous atrocities with U.S. support. At best, they confuse people enough that they don't speak clearly against Israel's atrocities. They stay passive and refuse to take a stance. Pinkwashing and imperial feminism cause people to be progressive in everything but Palestine. In this video, this Palestinian comedian is responding to audience members who talk about Israel as being progressive on women's rights and gay rights.
You are literally spitting out APAC talking points. Whoa! They come in APAC. If you agree with that? The Arabs and Muslims are atrocious. Do you agree with that part? All right, everybody, quiet. This is my show. I'm against any loss of human rights, whether it's Muslim people or LGBTQ people, but why does that have to come up when we're talking about the loss of human rights of people being bombed literally right now? You know what that's called? It's called pinkwashing. pink washing, which is not when you mix your reds and whites in the washing machine, which I initially had thought it was. I've lost many good shirts with the pink washer. Right? This guy knows what I'm talking about, right? Definition of pink washing is exploiting the LGBTQ for a political point. It's like, oh, look at their track record of gay rights. Check everywhere's track record of gay rights. It's absolute. Yes. If you're not a pink washer, you're at least a heckler, for sure. So stop telling LGBTQ folks how to feel about Palestine. Newsflash, they can decide things on their own. If you can pick your pronouns, you can pick a stance, okay? Because if you thought that queer folk would be down with bombing kids, you didn't know queer folk in the first place. Okay? They ain't like that. They ain't like that, and I mean they.
Okay, Nada Elia, Palestinian professor and activist, summarizes imperial feminism and pink washing well. Quote, imperial feminism, which presents women's rights as a Western gift to the benighted Orient, and a pink washing, which celebrates Israel as gay-friendly because its soldiers can fly a pride flag after torturing Palestinian prisoners. The project Queering the Map allows queer and trans folks to leave comments on a particular spot on a map. The one I highlighted here is from northern Gaza, and it says, quote, I don't know how long I will live, so I just want this to be my memory here before I die. I am not going to leave my home, come what may. My biggest regret is not kissing this one guy. He died 2 days back. We had told how much we liked each other, and I was too shy to kiss last time. He died in the bombing. I think a big part of me died too. And soon I will be dead. To Eunice, I will kiss you in heaven. Unquote. So no matter how much Israel funds a PR campaign to polish its image as culturally liberal, Palestinian women and Palestinian queer folks are as subject to its violence as any other Palestinian. So we started this class with a discussion of the concept of intersectionality, the way in which it's imperative to go beyond considering queerness on its own, to think deeply about queerness and gender on its own, right? To think deeply about how both queerness and gender intersects with other identity categories like race, class, religion, and so on. So this analytical tool tells us that we can't pick apart our identities. And so, as we are learning more about Israel and Palestine, I think it's imperative to look to queer Palestinians, first and foremost, to gain a deeper understanding and to strengthen our political commitment to challenging all systems of oppression. Now, as promised, I'd like to dive into the history to provide you with background knowledge, the background knowledge important for understanding the current context. Okay, to be clear, I think it's enough to take a moral stance based on what you are seeing happening today. The situation is not too complicated to do so. But this history can help you develop a deeper understanding of why we've gotten to this point. I'll start off by answering the question, what is Zionism? It's clear that Zionism comes in part as a result of anti-Semitism, but it's also, at its inception, rooted in European colonialism. In the late 19th century, there was a new wave of anti-Semitism across Europe, even in places where Jews were integrated into civil society. In this period, we saw the largest wave of Jewish immigration to the United States, for example, as Jewish families fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe. It's in this context that we see some Jewish thinkers propose Zionism as an alternative to assimilation and integration. In the late 19th century, European thinker Theodor Herzl, an Ashkenazi Jew, proposed Zionism as a response. He and other Zionists promoted a belief that an established Jewish state would provide self-determination and protection from escalating persecution in Europe. The Jewish state could be anywhere, initially, like Brazil or Zimbabwe. So this proposed Jewish state, in other words, did not initially need to be in what is currently called Israel, i.e. historic Palestine. So keep this point in mind. Many Zionists point to Jewish ancestral claims to the land of Israel, but Zionists in the 19th century were thinking in colonial terms. South America and Africa were, after all, both, quote, widely acceptable as places of European colonialism, unquote. This is a quote by Edward Said in 1979. In the early 20th century, the British colonial empire helped Zionists to establish Palestine as the location for a Jewish state. despite the presence of Palestinian Arabs in long-established towns and cities. But it wasn't until the aftermath of the Holocaust that Zionists gained broader global support for establishing a Jewish state in historic Palestine. So historically, there are different strands of Zionism, but our focus here is on political Zionism, which has proven itself triumphant and is fundamentally rooted in the displacement of Palestinians and the interest of maintaining a Jewish majority with superior rights to the land of Israel and its resources. Zionism, then, is a form of Jewish nationalism, but it's also a settler colonial framework that drove the establishment of a Jewish ethno-state in historic Palestine. And from its inception, Zionism was a political project primarily promoted by Ashkenazi European Jews, seeking to concentrate Jews in one location despite our presence in diaspora around the world. And because of this, the racial hierarchy of European thinking fundamentally influenced Zionism from the start. In what Zionists now call Israel, aka Palestine, European Jews were always at the top of the hierarchy, with Jews of color, Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews at the bottom. So Theodor Herzl once said, "We should there form a portion of a rampart against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence." In this quote, Herzl is explicitly aligning his desired Jewish state with white European colonial empires such as Great Britain. So what is colonialism? I went over this during the lesson plan on Native Americans and U.S. women's history, so this should be review. From the 15th century onward, colonialism involved European empires violently seizing other regions of the world, largely inhabited by people of color, for the purposes of profit. And as Herzl and others were drafting Zionist ideas, Europe's colonization of Africa and parts of Asia, and the ideas undergirding the second wave of European colonialism in the 19th century, clearly influenced Zionist thinking. As Palestinian intellectual Edward Said said, quote, "Zionism never spoke of itself unambiguously as a Jewish liberation movement, but rather as a Jewish movement for colonial settlement of the Orient," unquote. Dehumanizing and racist rhetoric has been used to justify this project. There are different kinds of colonialism, but historically Britain, the US, Israel, and other countries have engaged in settler colonialism, which involved colonizers taking the land and displacing the indigenous population. As this image makes clear, in what is currently called the United States, for example, the British first and the US government after the Revolution, as it embarked on their project of settler colonialism, carried out via genocide, just as Israel is doing in Gaza, by using similar language to Herzl, referring to native people as, quote, barbarian and savage, by claiming to bring civilization to them, right? The goals are similar: steal the land, dispossess the people, and use violent means to do so. As a leading Zionist thinker, Herzl was not alone in promulgating the settler colonial vision for Israel. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, said, quote, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places, and if we have to use force to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal," unquote. Then, quote, "During the assault, we must be ready to strike the decisive blow. That is, either to destroy the towns or expel its inhabitants so our people can replace them," unquote. So these quotes by leading Zionists hammer home the colonial, racist nature of political Zionism at its inception, from the perspective of Jewish Zionists. However, as Palestinian American scholar and activist Edward Said made clear, it's most important to understand Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. Edward Said said, considering the history of Israel's treatment of the indigenous Palestinian population, quote, "The fact also that no Palestinian, regardless of his political stripe, has been able to reconcile himself to Zionism suggests the extent to which, for the Palestinian, Zionism has appeared to be an uncompromisingly exclusionary, discriminatory, and colonialist praxis." Those Zionists like to say that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. They well knew there were people who populated Palestine. Photographs 1 to 2. So these photos show Palestinian life prior to 1948. The first photo is the Palestinian delegation to the first conference of Arab women in 1938. This conference was organized by the Egyptian Feminist Union and was focused specifically on the rights of Palestinian Arabs in Palestine, i.e. present-day Israel. Feminists would go on to form the Arab Feminist Union in 1944 with feminists from several Arab countries. The second photo is of women and children in the women's workshop in Ramallah in the 1930s. Ramallah is located in a central area of the West Bank, which is currently under occupation by the Israeli army. This third photograph shows Palestinian girls pushing their belongings in strollers and wheelbarrows and fleeing Jaffa in 1948. It hints at the utter destruction that the founding of the State of Israel ultimately wrought for the indigenous Palestinian inhabitants. And of course, we've seen countless images like this one in the present day as Palestinians have been forced to leave home in search of safety when nowhere is safe in Gaza. What Israel celebrates as its founding, Palestinians mourn as the Nakba, which in Arabic means the catastrophe. So why? Zionist military and political leaders carried out a plan to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian population to establish the State of Israel. In the lead up to its founding, Zionist leaders encouraged and funded Jewish immigration, which of course increased during the rise of the Nazis to power and during the Holocaust. In 1990, just after the time of the First Zionist Congress, 8% of Palestine was Jewish. By 1947, 31% was Jewish, and they owned 6% of the land. As you can see here, in 1948, Israel declared its founding on 78% of historic Palestine. The founding of Israel made clear the colonial intentions underlying Zionism. And the result, a diasporic people, Jews, forced another people, Palestinians, into a diaspora. Numbering 6 million, well more by now, Palestinian refugees make up the world's largest refugee population. To establish Israel, Israeli soldiers carried out 30-plus massacres, killing at least 13,000 people. In the process, it forcibly displaced around 750,000 Palestinians of a total of 1.3 million, and that's 80% of the population. Zionists systematically destroyed and emptied 530 towns and cities. This is the definition of ethnic cleansing. The new State of Israel refused to permit the return of Palestinian refugees and explicitly forbade even selling back stolen Palestinian lands to Palestinians. The militias that founded Israel would soon form Israel's army, and the militia leaders would become Israel's presidents, prime ministers, and war heroes. Historians have shown that Israel had a plan, e.g., Plan Dalet 1948, to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. So what you see here, in other words, is not the inevitable, albeit unfortunate, consequences of war. This was planned. What's not clear in this image is that Zionist forces deliberately employed attacks against Palestinian women to intimidate and force the indigenous population to flee. As you know, colonizers in the Americas used sexual violence as they colonized Native Americans and their land. This form of gender-based violence has been historically central to colonizing projects, and Israel is no exception. Here's one example. In the April of 1948, Zionists committed a massacre at Deir Yassin, killing about 300 Palestinian villagers. Many women at Deir Yassin were reported to have been sexually assaulted before being killed. In Arabic, this means the setback, Naksa. In 1967, just 19 years after its founding, Israel occupied the remaining 22% of Palestinian land, including the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, controlling all of Palestine. Israeli soldiers invaded and bombed Palestinian neighborhoods and wiped out entire villages, forcing another 300,000 Palestinians to flee their homes. And 130,000 of this number were displaced in 1948. So they're displaced for a second time. So when we talk about the two-state solution, this is what we're referring to. A Palestinian state on 22% and an Israeli state on 78% of Palestine. So that, 22% is in Gaza and the West Bank. In any event, the Israeli state, driven by an ideology rooted in ongoing displacement and fragmentation, has never even agreed to this two-state solution. Since 1967, Israel has subjected Palestinians to a brutal and illegal military occupation. This means Israel controls nearly every aspect of Palestinian life, dictating where Palestinians can live, travel, whether they can access and use their own resources. Okay, this map shows the occupied territories after 1967. As you can see, since 1967, in the West Bank, Israeli settlers, colonial settlers, with the support of Israeli politicians and the Israeli army, have been stealing Palestinian land as time goes on. Palestinians are divided and fragmented from each other. Occupation means Israeli control over the land, resources, and its borders. Zionism is a political movement for the establishment of the modern state of Israel. Because the founding of the state involved displacement and murder of an entire Palestinian population, we see a lot of lying and mental and moral gymnastics by Zionist leaders. In 1969, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir famously proclaimed that, quote, "There was no such thing as Palestinians, they did not exist," unquote. And they never existed. This is clear settler colonial logic, claims that Palestinians did not and do not exist as a people to justify further displacement. It is also racist, and even the UN acknowledged as much. The UN General Assembly declared in 1979 that, quote, "Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination," unquote. You'll often hear Zionists today argue that Jews are entitled to the land of Palestine because there are many other Arab and or Muslim majority countries, and Jews have just this one place. This is premised on the racist denial of Palestinian ethnic and cultural identity. So if Zionism is the movement for the establishment of the state, it begs the question, what is Zionism after the establishment of the state? The answer is the support for the economic and military expansion of the state. There has been a massive movement to redefine Zionism as exclusively the Jewish right to self-determination rather than a colonial project, which it has always been. But this is a politically strategic fabrication meant to obscure the goals of Zionism, the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish majority, an ethno-state in Israel, which fundamentally necessitates the privileging of Jews above Palestinians. And nowhere is this more clear than in the structural forms of discrimination Israel imposes on Palestinians. In its 2022 report, Amnesty International confirmed what many have long known: Israel is an apartheid state. Many associate the word with South Africa, which institutionalized a hierarchy and racial segregation that privileged white above black South Africans. The Jim Crow South was also structured by apartheid. In its report, Amnesty says, quote, "Apartheid consists of a system of prolonged and cruel discriminatory treatment by one racial group of members of another with the intention to control the second racial group." How is Israel an apartheid state? Israel has racist policies in place to maintain a Jewish majority. In Jerusalem, for instance, its official policy is to remain at least a 60% Jewish majority. Jews in the diaspora have the right to live in Israel and claim citizenship, while Palestinian refugees are denied the same right. As a Jewish person myself, I can go and claim citizenship and live there at any point in time, but Palestinians who are refugees and the descendants of refugees are not able to. Israel maintains geographic segregation, with more resources and rights given to Jews above Palestinians. There are 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank who have access to only 40% of the land. The rest is for the 500,000 Jewish settlers. Since 2007, Israel trapped 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Israel maintains a system of separate and unequal roads in the West Bank and forces Palestinians to go through dehumanizing checkpoints to do basic things. Israel has a system of ID cards that privileges Jews. Jewish Israelis have a single ID card that permits them to live almost anywhere. Palestinians have 4 types of ID cards, each controlling what they can do and where they can go. Political suppression, violence, and imprisonment. Israel denies Palestinians the right to free political participation and peaceful protest inside Israel and in the occupied territories. Palestinians, including children, protesting Israeli policies are often brutalized and imprisoned, often without charge for many years. Israel has denied resources, stealing land and water, and controlling the borders to Palestinians, and denied them economic opportunity, consigning many to poverty. Israel has consistently denied building permits to Palestinians, which means they must build without permits, which puts them at risk of their homes being demolished, which Israel regularly does. In the West Bank in 2020, on average, 18 Palestinian structures were demolished every week. The same year, Israel issued 1,094 building permits for Jewish applicants and only 1 for Palestinians. Originating in European Christianity, anti-Semitism is the form of ideological oppression that targets Jews. According to Jews for Economic and Racial Justice, anti-Semitism can be defined this way. Quote, originating in European Christianity, anti-Semitism is the form of ideological oppression that targets Jews. In Europe and the United States, it has functioned to protect the prevailing economic system and the almost exclusively Christian ruling class by diverting blame for hardship onto Jews. The myth changes and adapts to different times and places, but fundamentally it says that Jews are to blame for society's problems. So we are seeing a push by right-wing organizations to push universities to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. IHRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. So the IHRA begins its definition of anti-Semitism this way. Quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, right, doesn't sound so wrong. It's a little vague. So the example applications of it are where we can see the conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Here are some of the example ways to apply the IHR definition that it gives on its website. So accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. So I think this one makes some sense, right? The accusation against Jews of dual loyalty is an age-old anti-Semitic trope. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. This is where we start getting to the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. To critique Israel as a racist state doesn't make one anti-Semitic. It makes one opposed to racism. Applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Again, the focus here is on Israel. When we call Israel's genocide, what it's doing genocide, that doesn't mean we don't understand that other countries commit atrocities. Right? Using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, e.g. claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. Okay, these latter examples are complex, but, you can see here that Israel gets wrapped into the definition of anti-Semitism in a way that's meant to further conflate Israel with Jewish identity when the two are not the same. So my grandparents, who were Jewish, were born before the establishment of the Israeli state. Jewish people in the U.S., including people I know and love, have been taught to align their Jewish identity with Zionism. Indoctrination by Zionists has been key to making this happen. For instance, Birthright is a program that allows any Jew in the world to travel to and live in Israel. It's offered and pushed at most campus Hillels, which is supposed to be an organization serving Jewish students on college campuses, but also focuses on encouraging young Jewish Americans to associate their identity with Israel and thus to support Israeli policies. A few other ways this happens include, at American rabbinical schools that send students for a year to study in Israel, suggesting that to be an American rabbi, it's foundational to have a relationship with Israel. To spur young Jews to have a relationship with Israel pre-army age, there are middle and high school Israel programs. This builds loyalty to the state and can motivate kids to move there and serve in the military. There's encouragement in many Jewish institutions, like synagogues, to celebrate Israeli national holidays in American Jewish communities. B'nai mitzvahs for American Jewish teenagers often happen in Israel. And I mention all of this because these efforts help us to understand how it is that anti-Zionism, as well as even just criticisms of Israel's policies often, get interpreted as anti-Semitism, even though these things are very different. This effort to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism ignores a long history of Jewish anti-Zionism. I find this history to be very interesting and could spend a long time on it, but I'll try to be brief. For well over a century, Jews around the world have issued robust criticisms of Zionism as well as the state of Israel. Until the mid-20th century, opposition to Zionism was the dominant position in the Orthodox Jewish world and continues to be a strongly held perspective by some today. According to Jewish thought, the return of the Messiah would usher in the end of exile, the restitution of the Jewish kingdom in the Holy Land, and an era of peace and justice around the world. Because of this, most Orthodox Jews rejected Zionism as a false Messiah. So, reform anti-Zionism. Throughout the early 20th century, the reform movement within Jewish life insisted Jews should remain in diaspora. Many feared that Zionist ideology would endanger the integration of Jews in their home countries and that they would be accused of dual loyalty. Many Sephardic Jewish communities in Palestine rejected the arrival of European Jews. They shared a strong communal bond with their neighbors, forged over centuries of often peaceful coexistence, and resisted external attempts to bifurcate their hybrid Arab-Jewish national and cultural identities. So there's also the Jewish Labor Bund in Eastern Europe. This grassroots Jewish socialist movement in the first half of the 20th century claimed hundreds of thousands of members across Eastern Europe. It organized against capitalist exploitation and racist oppression in all of its forms. And the Bund strongly rejected Zionism as a bourgeois answer to the Jewish question. The call for a Jewish state, they said, was an escapist response to anti-Semitism favored by the middle and upper classes. Bundists championed the idea that the home worth fighting for was the home where one was, and would later be encapsulated in one Yiddish word, Doigkeit, or here-ness. This concept of Doigkeit resonates today with many Jews on the left, including myself, who want to cultivate our Jewish identities separate from Zionism and are drawn to such histories of resistance. Many Jews, moreover, decried the promotion of Hebrew, which helped in the decline of Yiddish, which my own grandparents and great-grandparents spoke. Socialist and anarchist Jewish anti-Zionism, the United States. In the U.S., Jewish immigrants brought the Bund with them, but there was also many other Jewish socialist anarchists, communists and anarchists committed to the Jewish tradition of anti-Zionism. They believed in internationalism rather than a narrow nationalism that involved the concentration of Jews in historic Palestine, and they fought with others for social and economic justice, choosing to fight where they were rather than leave. There's also Jewish anti-Zionism in the Middle East and North Africa. While some Jews in the Middle East and North Africa supported Zionism throughout the middle of the 20th century, the majority regarded themselves as fully a part of the countries in which they lived. Many Jewish intellectuals in Arab countries asserted solidarity with Palestinians against Zionism. So in one example, the Anti-Zionist League was an organization of Iraqi Jewish intellectuals and activists founded in 1945 that, quote, opposed Zionism as a form of colonialism and a front for British control over the Middle East, unquote. So the Holocaust, when the Nazis systematically killed nearly 2/3 of the European Jewish population, this led to a decline in opposition to Zionism among Jews. And in the US, the anti-communism of the 1940s and 1960s helped to relegate Jewish radicalism to the margins. And it was among the Jewish left, the people targeted by anti-communism, that was most likely to oppose Zionism. There's a complicated history there, but I don't want to get into it right now. But as Israel committed new atrocities, the 1967 occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, the Sabra and Shatila massacres of 1982, and the two Palestinian intifadas, which brought global attention to the Palestinian struggle, increasingly activists in the U.S., including many Jews, came to see Zionism more clearly for what it is. The Vietnam War, the anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, and queer movements of the 1960s and 1970s into the 1980s, if we think of ACT UP, helped to facilitate a rebirth of the Jewish New Left, even as Israel worked hard to attach American Jewish identity to Israeli identity. I encourage you to see the documentary Israelism for more on this. So this created a greater divide among Jews than ever before, with many Jews in the United States claiming a liberal or progressive politics, with one very large exception, Israel's treatment of Palestinians, that to many of us cast doubt on the sincerity of their other political commitments. Anti-Zionism is the criticism of Zionism, Israeli state policies, and or moral, ethical, or religious criticism of the idea of a Jewish nation state. Anti-Zionism rejects the necessity of a Jewish ethno-state and recognizes Israel as a settler colonial project that upholds apartheid and military occupation. Anti-Zionism believes that a vibrant diasporic Jewish movement that operates from a place of solidarity is the antidote to anti-Semitism. White supremacy and Christian hegemony are the roots of anti-Semitism, which also oppresses Palestinian, white Arab, and Muslim communities. So systemic anti-Arab racism and anti-Muslim racism have existed in this country for decades. In particular, as an outgrowth of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, including U.S. policy in support of Israel and what scholars call imperial racism. We've seen countless dehumanizing representations of Arabs and Muslims in the media, portraying them as terrorists and as culturally backward. And these media representations have served not only to directly harm Arab Americans and Muslims in the U.S., but they've served to desensitize many Americans to both Israeli and U.S. atrocities. If not racism, what else do you call either justifying or looking away from the mass murder of over 15,000 Palestinian children in Gaza? If not racism, what else do you call the refusal to understand the context for October 7th? Without context, the violence perpetuated by Hamas on October 7th against Israelis is the work of an irrational people naturally prone to violence connected to Islam, who couldn't possibly have legitimate grievances rooted in decades of occupation, land theft, apartheid, and dehumanization. Anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism has played out within the U.S. in a multiplicity of ways, including bullying and exclusions from the curriculum at school, employment and housing discrimination, immigration exclusions, Trump's Muslim ban during his first term, and as we've seen recently, rising hate crimes against Palestinians, specifically and other Arab Americans and Muslims in the U.S. CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, reported over 8,000 incidents of bias and hate in 2023 alone. Right, 2023, the highest number recorded in their 30-year history, including after 9/11. So we're talking October to December, basically, when most of these are happening. Anti-Palestinian racism is connected to anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism, but it's also distinctive. It targets people because of their Palestinian identity or because they support Palestinian rights. Anti-Palestinian racism focuses specifically on Palestinians' culture, heritage, and their movements of liberation, often manifesting through suppressing speech and activism related to the Palestinian cause. And importantly, for our purposes, the conflation of anti-Zionism or even just criticisms of Israel with anti-Semitism serves to perpetrate anti-Palestinian racism, creating the perception of a zero-sum game. If Palestinians gain political or civil rights, Israelis and by proxy Jews lose safety. The false conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism has served to weaponize false accusations of anti-Semitism to target Palestinians and their allies across the globe. We've seen efforts to ban the keffiyeh, the traditional Palestinian scarf, including even at the Museum of Science and Curiosity in Sacramento. The New York Times instructed its journalists not to use the word Palestine except for in rare cases. The denial of promotions and jobs and the firing of Palestinians and their allies. The banning of pro-Palestinian student groups on college campuses. The police being called in to brutalize and arrest peaceful protesters, simply calling for an end to U.S. complicity in Israel's genocide. This violence is often meted out when Jewish students say they feel unsafe by the presence of protests against Israeli genocide. Congressional hearings questioning university presidents, demanding that they condemn calls for Palestinian freedom, using slogans like "from the river to the sea" as calls for Jewish genocide, which is absurd. Legislatures supporting expanding the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticisms of Israel, including efforts at the national level. This exclusion of any discussion of Palestine from the California K through 12 ethnic studies curriculum. We also see the media uncritically reporting on rising anti-Semitism while largely ignoring or minimizing anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism. The media often cite the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and spends much of its resources attacking anyone who dares speak up for Palestinian rights. And we've seen the rise of hate crimes specifically targeting Palestinians. To give you just two examples. In May 2024, an intoxicated woman, Elizabeth Wolfe, began shouting racial slurs at a Palestinian mother in a Texas apartment complex. She was wearing a hijab and modest swimwear. The woman, Elizabeth Wolfe, jumped into the pool, ripped off her headscarf, and held her 3-year-old underwater. Quote, "Tell her I will kill her and I will kill her whole family," she shouted after the arrest. And then in October 2023, Wadia Al-Fayoum was stabbed and killed. He's 6 years old, and his mother seriously injured by their landlord in their Illinois apartment. They're Palestinian. Nowhere is anti-Palestinian racism seen most clearly than in the continued dehumanization of Palestinians in Gaza, which is being carried out, right? This genocide, which is being carried out by means of genocide, as well as continued occupation, violence, and incarceration in the West Bank. It has been over a year, as I record this, since the carnage in Gaza began. There's a new massacre every day. To bring this back to gender, something the media hasn't paid close attention to is the level of reproductive violence in Gaza. The United Nations has critiqued Israel for systematically targeting Palestinian women and girls. But they also pointed to the torture, which includes sexual violence committed against Palestinian men in Israel's prisons. Additionally, before the recent onslaught in Gaza, it was clear that hunger, like poverty, is feminized. Due to Israel's blockade on Gaza since 2007, before October 2023, 80% of Gaza's population depended on international assistance to get by. And a survey from 2017 found that 25% of pregnant women in Gaza were anemic, and 25% of Palestinian women in the Gaza Strip and West Bank were at risk of death during childbirth. Palestinian women and others who can give birth had difficulty accessing quality reproductive health care prior to October 7th. But in Gaza today, with so many hospitals destroyed, birth wards and neonatal intensive care units, or NICUs, have also been destroyed, making pregnancy and birth all the more dangerous. I want to end on a more positive note, even as I recognize the current situation makes that difficult. But since Israel's genocide began, millions of people around the world, including in the US, have taken to the streets to demand a ceasefire. Here's a very small sampling of some of these protests. This is a picture from San Francisco, London, Washington, D.C., Jakarta, Indonesia, South Africa, Pakistan, Grand Central Station, New York. Last spring, there were countless campus protests demanding that university administrators divest from genocide and apartheid, including at Sacramento State University. Students didn't rally for one day. They set up tent encampments at universities across the country, and the demand was divestment. Divesting from Israel's war machine. This photo is from UC Berkeley. This is from UT Austin. And this is a photo from the Sac State encampment.
Wake up, child, wake up, listen, 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 singing, wake up, child, wake up, listen, 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 listen.
That's from a campus protest, I forget which one. And then on January 3rd last year, I joined a Jewish-led protest that involved occupying the California State Capitol Rotunda and sitting in the assembly chambers to demand that our own state government stop investing in genocide and instead to invest in things like, healthcare and schools. This is a photo of what the Rotunda looked like during the protest. You can see that it says 30,000 dead. Now the number is at least 44,000 dead. People made red poppies from paper with each representing 20 Palestinian lives. Here's a photo from inside the State Assembly Room, which we shut down in protest on the first day of the session. I was there. So we've done more than protest, of course. We've also incessantly called our political leaders. We've worked to get ceasefire resolutions passed in our cities and towns, including in Sacramento. And we are working on divestment campaigns to get our governments to stop investing in companies that profit off of genocide and to get consumers to stop buying at companies like Starbucks and Chevron that also make money in Israel. In the Los Rios district, we have a Faculty for Justice in Palestine group. In the community, there are various groups that have been active, including the Sacramento Regional Coalition for Palestinian Rights and Jewish Voice for Peace, the group of which I am a member. To conclude, it's clear that what is happening in Gaza is horrific. Nobody should justify the mass slaughter of civilians, including at least 17,000 Palestinian children. It's important to understand that settler colonialism in Palestine is a central context for understanding the current situation. And it's also important to understand the ways in which colonial violence is always gendered. Finally, without U.S. support, this could not go on. I encourage you to think critically, to ask questions, and to continue learning.